we're joined by Zach Elwood, or Zachary Elwood. He goes by both. And Zach is in a unique position. He is a former professional poker player, but he's also, I'd say, a coach or mentor to other poker players out there and studies reading poker tells, body language, and how to get ahead in the game. How are you doing today, Zach?
All right. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thanks for coming on. And I was just talking about before the show, and I know next to nothing about poker. I mean, I've seen it played in movies, and I'm sure that I played around when I was in high school and probably lost my lunch money a few times, but I really, really, really have no clue or idea about it. So we've got to understand we're starting at ground zero. But I'm
Gotcha.
very interested in the sexy
Hmm.
lifestyle of the professional poker player. You want to
Right.
talk about that a little bit? Are you Dan Blazarian?
Oh, not quite. Yeah, can't compete with him on that level, on the sexiness level. But there definitely is a sexy quality, especially with the poker behavior aspect, like the poker tells aspect, like because I try to be honest with people in my books and tell them the full scope of, poker is mostly about strategy, and
Mhm.
poker tells is a small part of the game, really. Like you can add to your win rate, but most of it is just thinking it through logically the best strategies and trying to find the best strategies. But as far as like the lifestyle, no, I was never leading some crazy high stakes life. I mean, I never played very high stakes myself. I played in like a mid range stakes when I was playing for a living, and but the I think that you're right that the sexiness, there is something kind of like dangerous and exciting about the poker world, and that kind of was an aspect for me getting into it, drew me to it. Also, just the psychology of it. I was always interested in the psychology aspects of it. But I think you're right that some people are drawn to that kind of like, oh, this is exciting. This is some, these seedy games and backroom games and the weird characters you'll meet is part of the appeal, I think.
Yeah, it almost feels to me like you're just shy of being a criminal, but it's legal. So you can be a bad boy, but it's not against the law. Well, depending on where you are.
Right.
I'm sure that some are.
And depending on the frame, depending on the context, it can be a very nerdy pastime. But yeah, there is that element. Like when I played in Albuquerque, that's where I started playing for a living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is can be a
Mhm.
rough town. Like I knew somebody I played poker with that got shot to death, and I knew people that got
Oh.
mugged and beaten up and went to the hospital coming out of home games, and that it has definitely can have a that element. But for in a lot of cases, it's just like it can also just be a lot of nerdy math oriented people playing online. It has various depending on the setting, it has different moods.
Okay, that's fascinating about the online because I think you already answered a question I've always had about online because I always thought that poker was all tells. Now you're sort of saying that it's like a 5 to 10%
Yeah.
ratio. I think you said in the book, um, and it's all strategy. And is that how online video poker somebody can be successful at it? Is because you
Right.
don't have to have a tell?
And it's not, now to clarify, it's not video poker. That's like something you play at the bar just against the
Oh,
machine. But
okay.
yeah, so it'd be online poker. But yeah, it's mostly, yeah, like I say in the books, it's you know you can be a hugely winning poker player and never think about tells. Tells are something that are like the icing on the cake, so to speak. Like they're something that can add to your win rate if you're aware of them in live games. But you can be a great player, and there's many great players that never, probably hardly ever think about tells. And so the truth is, it's just poker is just such a complex game. Like when you take no limit poker, trying to solve it from like a game theory perspective is it's a more complex game than chess.
Hmm.
More of the game tree. It's a more complex game tree. Like when you think about what is the proper bet sizing you have in this scenario, what do you do when someone raises you at this X amount of bet sizing? No limit is just, it has a tremendously complex game tree, as they call it. And there's there's programs, there's people creating algorithms trying to solve it, but it's even more complex than chess to try to approach something that is like, this is the right decision, and will not lose money to a better strategy. So yeah, it's tremendously complex, and the thing about poker is it's deceptively simple seeming on the surface, because you can play poker for a few minutes and be like, oh, this makes sense, I get the idea, it seems simple, but its seeming simplicity is where all the money lies, because from Dunning-Kruger effect, you can quickly get the impression that you are very good at something when you actually have many, many years ahead of you to get good at something.
Great point about Dunning-Kruger. And I think I've read somewhere, and I had a theory that it might be true, that gambling addictions, because I'm sure that's something you have to deal with in the field or really look at. But someone who goes out the gate and they win a lot of money, like on their first run, tend to become the gambling addicts later on in life, because they're chasing that. They did it. It was so easy, and that full on Dunning-Kruger in that effect. Whereas somebody like me, who's just a loser, I'm not likely to become addicted. I won't even play the freaking lottery, because I'm like, well, that's another dollar in my pocket.
No, you're right. I mean, it's a good observation. I mean, there's plenty of people in the poker world that had early success that I think, in my opinion, and probably many people's opinions, it was probably the worst thing to happen to them. Like they quickly won a big tournament right out the gate, and then they got a mistaken idea of how easy that lifestyle would be. Then they quickly went through it, that money, and quickly went on the more realistic downswing that, was the long-term reality. And yeah, that kind of stuff sets you up for failure. I mean, I can easily imagine, that happening to me if I had been. And actually, I did have something like that when I first started playing online. I had a huge winning first month. Like I won like $16,000 or something my first month of online poker, and it wasn't even that high stakes. It was like pretty low stakes, and I was like, wow, this is easy, And I went around like a jackass, acting like I was a big shot for a while and telling my friends, and then lost like 5,000 the next month, lost a few thousand the next month. So it's a long-term game, and I was very inexperienced when I started out, but I got that. I had that impression, and that can easily happen, as you can imagine, to anyone when you talk about the swings that are possible in poker. At any given time, someone's easily experiencing a unrealistic upswing early on in their career, which sets them up for emotional, hardship.
Can we talk about your career? I mean, how does one get into that? You just saw an ad in the paper and it said, oh, you have a game at place. How'd you do it?
No, for me, it was a long kind of process. Like I used to play poker at my friend's house when I was young, like in, middle school and high school. I went over and played with his parents and his parents' friends, and it seemed like this cool environment, and I was really always interested in the psychology of it too, because my dad had a lot of random psychology books floating around the house, and I was reading, like Freud's pathopsychology, the what is it, the pathology of everyday life, or the pathopsychology of everyday life, about observing everyday things and trying to find meaning in them. So I had that kind of background, and then in college I was organizing games. I had met some people who were interested in poker, and I organized games and took my friends' money, and because I took it more seriously than they did, and I was reading books about it, and then started playing online when that became available in like 2000, around the year 2000. And then I moved to Albuquerque and met some people who were, this was right around when the poker boom was happening in 2003, when poker was really becoming popular. And so in Albuquerque, when I played in the casinos there, I met some people who were playing higher stakes than I was, and they took it more seriously than I did, and they were actually, making a living at it, because the poker boom meant that there were just a lot of bad players playing. So I started being more encouraged to get into it, and that's what led to me playing at the casino and online for a few years in a row. This was like 3.5 years, 4 years, and then after that, I just played on the side. Like, it was never my intention to do this for a living, and honestly, it's a hard psychological way to make a living. There, even when you're doing well, it's like, as you probably know, the negative things that happen to us affect us more than the positive things. So there can kind of be this tendency, even when you're doing well at poker, to kind of store the negative sessions and the negative things that happen to you much more than you do the positive things. And so I think, especially if you're not, cut out for it emotionally, it can be very trying on you. And so for me, it was pretty anxiety producing, more than I think for other people who might just be more emotionally steady people. So that's one of the reasons I didn't want to do it long term. Like I never had the inclination to like move to Vegas and play high stakes or anything like that. It was, I kind of had an awareness that was not in the cards for me, so to speak. The just knowing myself emotionally and knowing how kind of isolating poker was and how anxiety producing it was. And I was much happier playing on the side, since then. It just was much less pressure, and you don't do it as much. You don't have to, as they say, it's a hard way to make an easy living, I think is the saying. So yeah, and then while I was playing for a living in, like 2004 to 2003 to 2007, around that, I had the idea that I saw very few poker books PokerTells books that I respected. There was the classic Mike Caro book, which was written in like 1980, which was considered like the best book. But I'd always observed things and I talked to other poker players who had observed things that I had just never seen written about, which was kind of how that led to me over the years. Eventually in like 2010, I decided to do it. When I didn't see another book come out that I respected, I decided to write it myself, and that's what led to that stuff. Yeah.
So do you get more joy out of studying the mechanics and the atmosphere of the game versus playing the game yourself?
It's complicated. I mean, I have kind of have a love-hate relationship with poker, which I think is true for a lot of people. You can find similar people saying similar things. It's like, I was always drawn to it, but it's also like it wears on you. I feel it wore on me emotionally to play it for many hours in a week, like treating it like a job. Was very wearing on me. I think that's a pretty common thing. I mean, I think there's very few people too that have kind of what they call alligator blood, which is kind of this like coldness about the swings of poker and the taking a bad beat, getting a really unlucky beat is a bad beat. Those things can really wear on you, but some people I think are just more emotionally cold in that respect and can handle that stuff better.
Yeah, that's one thing. I don't know if it's a direct comparison, but I was stationed in California when I was in the Army at Fort Irwin, and went to Vegas and I played blackjack. And I followed the basic rules of as I was told, very very careful, do this, do this, do this. And I won. I probably came out to 100 something ahead, whatever. It's very small stakes, but I couldn't help but think, Jesus, this is a job. I make more money per hour doing anything else than just sitting here at the table doing that. Is that a similar type of scenario that poker can actually be work? Like you've got to put hours and
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's work in the sense of actually playing the game, but if you're serious about poker, you should constantly be studying it because there's just so much to learn. I mean, and honestly, it's rare. It's a rare person that can be objective enough to realize all the things that need to be realized to be a very strong player of poker, because you have to be objective enough to recognize your own flaws and be honest about them. You have to also realize how little you know, which is there's that tempting Dunning-Kruger thing to overestimate what you know. You have to realize just how complex where all the factors are, and recognize like, well, I know very little about this area. There's just so much learning. I mean, the nice thing about poker, what really drew me to poker, was that it is such a complex game. Not just the strategy and math of it, but the psychology of it. That it's theoretically kind of in a Zen way, that it's such a wide open framework that you can imagine working your whole life on poker and never maxing out your abilities. It is that complex. And yeah, it's work for sure, and understanding where you stand in hierarchy of skill can be kind of draining because, my estimate of my own game, for example, has gone down over time as, as they've come out with more learnings about what the right thing to do is in certain poker situations. My awareness of like, oh, I don't understand this game theory optimal stuff which is very complex. So, if anything, my own estimate of my game is, as much as I'm probably am actually getting better, I also feel like
Mhm.
I'm more aware of how little I know.
Well, that's again Dunning-Kruger, but isn't that a factor of because you are consuming so much knowledge, you have to be smart enough to be able to look and see what's around the corner.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the less you know, it's like, okay, I know these 10 things and I know them really well. But those 10 things open up the path to suddenly see the 1,000 next things that
Hmm.
you really
Hmm.
couldn't see to begin with because you can't see the nuance until you get the beats.
Hmm. Yeah, to answer your question, it is work, and it's not and also it's not as exciting and sexy as it appears, because when you get down to it, most winning poker is about just taking advantage of weaker players who don't know that much. Like that's where, if you're making your living as a poker player, 90% of your income comes from just basically taking advantage of pretty weak players, players who overestimate their abilities. Some of your
Right.
income will come from people who are close in skill to you, but the large majority of it is trickling up from people who just don't know much about what they're doing and shouldn't be playing at that level, or they're just rich and they don't care or something, you know.
How do you deal with that? Is that part of it that troubled you? Because honestly, I would feel bad, especially if I got a vibe that, maybe they just got their paycheck, maybe they won't make their rent, do they have a wife and kid at home? Are people eating? How do
Yeah,
you cope?
I mean, that's a real thing to deal with too. I mean, as much as some people will try to avoid that, I mean, you can definitely find poker forum threads about that very subject, though, like, people debating about how bad you should feel, But yeah, in my case, that was definitely a factor, because in Albuquerque, especially when I was playing there, you could see some of these people shouldn't be playing. Some of these people couldn't really afford the amount of money they were losing. I knew one guy, which I talk a little bit about in my first book. I know somebody who, he had taken out a second mortgage on his house because he was obviously this was the guy I played with regularly. He was, just a degenerate gambler, and he ended up getting killed, and nobody really knows, what happened to him, but it's possible he, borrowed money from the wrong person, or who knows what, I don't really know, but it was a suspicious death. But yeah, these are real things to think about, and I definitely, yeah, I definitely had that conflict of, we're free people doing things, but obviously some people have problems, obviously, and that's something to deal with, to think about, and also just there was that vibe of, poker can be kind of alienating in the sense that when you're playing live, even though you're around people, it's like some of those people are problem gamblers. Some of them are kind of assholes because they're, either winning player assholes, or just people that can afford to lose, but they're just angry because they're kind of addicted to the game and bitter about stuff. And it was pretty few and far between when I interacted with people that I actually wanted to hang out with, or, be friends with. So that's
Hmm.
definitely, yeah, that's kind of a related thing, because it can be kind of a dark game full of a lot of people that are addicted to the game, really.
Now, obviously asked about that, and that's the impression, especially of the back room style. I'm going to guess that in a tournament, it's different.
Right. Yeah. I think tournaments have because they are, big events, and some people might just play a tournament like once or twice a year. It's not pre-selecting for the hardcore people that are coming out every day. So yeah, you have a point there. And I mainly was almost entirely, like 99%, I was a cash game player, which is like the regular, game that just ends when you want to get up and leave. There's no beginning or end to it. It's not a tournament. And that, yeah, you're right, that the tournament does have a cheerier atmosphere because it's more people having fun and maybe just doing it, occasionally. So that's a good, yeah.
And does it work that way? And I'm making an assumption. I'm guessing that you pay X amount of money to go into a tournament, and that's
Right.
it. You're all in, and you play as long
Then
as
you're
you're
out.
there, and
Yeah,
then you're
you're
out.
out when you're out, and there might be some other structure to it, like you rebuy. You're allowed to rebuy within the first X number of hours or something. But yeah, it's basically like once you're out, and you go home, and if you place within the X number of players, you get X number of money. It's a much more structured thing, and some people who go to the World Series of Poker might only play. The World Series of Poker has several a bunch of tournaments associated with it. It's not just the one main tournament. There's like a bunch of World Series of Poker tournaments, and the kind of people who go to those things might just play a few tournaments a year. That might be the extent of their poker playing. Yeah.
Do you have to qualify?
Oh, in tournaments, no. Anybody can, unless it's some special kind of invitational thing. Anybody can play in any poker, pretty much any poker tournament. Yeah. As long as you put the money down. Yeah.
Okay, and you got into it a little bit, of what you need. Can you describe the personality set that someone would need to have it? I mean, maybe, more specifically, I understand, the alligator blood, and you kind of
Mhm.
touched around it, but what are you looking for somebody to say, you know what, maybe you should be a poker player?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, with the landscape these days, poker has become much harder a game. Well, especially in COVID times, but even before the last few years, it's a much harder game. I mean, there's the state of the game, the state of the art of the game has progressed so much. With so many strong classes you can take. Like there's online poker training sites, and some of that stuff is so good now that the game has just advanced tremendously. Like it would be hard for many players who win live, like at live games, in-person games. It would be hard for a lot of those players to win even at a low stakes game online, for example, because the competition online is so great. For example, you have people from developing countries who may be playing low stakes and are taking it very seriously and studying a
Hmm.
lot, and that even pennies, or a few dollars to them is a significant
Real
amount
money.
of money and worth putting in that effort, globally. But so the game's just advanced so much, and even in the live games, like your average cash game you would go to in Vegas during the World Series of Poker, it has gotten much harder over the years because it attracts all these skilled players from around the world who, are going there for these loose games that attract a lot of tourist players,
Hmm.
recreational players. But because these games attract so many people to Vegas, for example, or to other places during different times of the year, they also attract all the sharks. So you might be playing against a few recreational players at the table, but you might have several very good players who have come out for that same reason. So to answer your question, I could definitely give you those psychological traits that I would name, but I would also say like it's gotten increasingly tough to make a living at poker and to really put in that work. You'd have to put in so much more work now than you would have, back say in the poker boom days when you could go
Hmm.
online and be like one of the best players in the game very easily, or even in a live game too. Yeah, it's just the competition has just increased so much, and the knowledge of the game has increased so much. But if I had to name a few characteristics that pre-select for somebody making it, it's being very humble. It's the humility aspect of recognizing it will probably take you many years to be very good. Uh, Being very objective, being willing to find flaws in yourself and really examine those flaws, and being super honest. And then it's just trying to work hard at not being results oriented, because as humans we are kind of wired to be results oriented. There's so many things in life that could go one way or another, and we tend to judge how it turns out instead of like how
Hmm.
the strategy that we use. For example, like we do something at work, and we get fired for it or we get in trouble for it, and we judge it based on whether we got in trouble, not as to whether we made the right decision or not, or something, something like that, where
So
we're
it's
very results driven.
process
Yeah,
driven
process
versus
driven.
results.
Yeah. And I guess that goes with
Okay.
the honesty. It's just really examining, being willing to logically examine everything and not be emotionally, try not to be emotionally affected by it, because we have that instinct too. When bad things happen, we take a bad beat at poker. Our instinct
Mhm.
is to be emotional, and so you kind of have to beat that out of yourself, and really be willing to be like, why am I getting emotional? Why is this bothering me if I know I made the right decision? Things like that. And so you really have to be objective. And I think if anything, even if you don't end up being a strong poker player long term, I think there is something really valuable to poker in the way that it forces you to confront all of these things, and it makes you less results oriented in life, because you try to be more objective and try to see like, well, yeah, things might have not turned out very well, but I tried my best and I did the best with my knowledge at the time. Those kinds of realizations. I really think there's kind of a zen kind of learning from it, where you become less attached to how things turn out, or the twists and turns of fate.
Okay, so it's kind of a long game principle. Like essentially you're going to lose and you're going to lose a lot, but you're you have to believe in the process of this is what I'm doing, and kind of like the stock market or whatever. You can't look at this. You kind of have to,
Hmm.
the up and down. You got to look at the overall slope. Are you in the
Right.
end further ahead than when you started? That would be a nightmare because I don't like losing. I don't think anybody really likes to lose. And if you
Yeah.
have to lose, I don't know,
So
am I
much.
wrong? Do you have to lose like 10 games to land one really large one that'll make up for all of them? But you just have
It's
to.
it's not like that, but it is. You're right when you say you have to be a good loser. Like, if that's definitely part of it. It's because you're going to have, even if you're the best player in the world, whether you're playing cash games or tournaments, you're going to have a lot of losing sessions. You're going to have a lot of losing tournaments. It's rare to get in the top X amount of the tournament and get that cash, or to get a good cash. Um, it's rare. You, as a winning poker player in cash games, non-tournament games, you're gonna win more than you lose, but
Mhm.
you might have really bad swings where you go through a tough patch of losing sessions. You might have really big losing sessions. It's gonna happen to you. It's kind of like you said. It's like a stock market thing where it's like you might go down and you come up. You might go down and you come up. If you look at a winning poker player's chart, there's lots of swings, but it's always trending upward. But those downward swings can be painful, and you can find it can really make you doubt your worldview, because if you've gone for a year or two and been doing pretty well at it, and then you experience a really bad downswing, and you're like, did I change? Am I doing something wrong? Was I lucky earlier? Am I playing better people suddenly? Like, what is the factors here? And that can be really hard to know, and that uncertainty can be really hard on you psychologically. So yeah, there's a lot of factors that make it tough, and really make you have to be super objective, or you're not going to make it.
Is it an oversaturated market now? Is that kind of the situation? Like you just um, everybody's super skilled. There's too many opportunities. Is it like have you read about the gold rush in the California gold rush?
Hmm. Yeah,
The
I mean,
people who made it.
yeah, it's definitely comparable. I mean, in some sense, in some ways it attracted a lot of people to the game. I mean, there's more people playing poker now than there were, um, 20 years ago. So in that sense, it's easier to find games. So there's positives in that sense for poker players who are serious about it. But on the other side, there is so much more competition now, and the game is so much more well understood, that at the higher stakes, it can be harder than it used to be in some senses. But yeah, it's kind of it's hard to say what the truth is, because there are just a lot more games in general than there used to be, and there's still a lot of recreational players who just like the
Mhm.
game, and are attracted to it because they watch rounders and play a few times a year and think it's exciting. But yeah, depending on where you're at, like the part of the country or the site you're on or whatever, I think overall it's tougher. Yeah.
Well, I was wondering too if like some of the money to being made now is around the game. And back to the
Mm,
gold rush, the people who
yeah.
made
Selling
all
it
the
too.
money were the ones who were selling the shovels.
Right. I think that's less true in poker than in other uh, games. Like, for example, traditionally casinos have been unlikely to invest in poker real estate in a casino because you actually make a lot less from poker tables than you do from
Hmm.
other gambling games because it's mainly a it's mainly a person player versus player game, and the house is just taking a cut of every
Okay.
pot. And real estate wise, it's not as lucrative as other games actually. So and then you can find some games that take even less than other games. Like, for example, there were games in Portland running that took less money out of the game than any other game in the country just due to the laws here. And people were saying they were the best game in the country. So depending on how much money is being subtracted is a big
Hmm.
factor in how profitable the game theoretically is, because if you get into a game where the casino or the house is not taking hardly any, if they're taking hardly any money, that's more likely to be a lucrative game because there's, obviously less money coming out of it. Whereas if you go to some countries where they'll take out like, you know, um, $20, $50 out of a pot, depending on the size of it, that never happens in the United States. And a game where they're taking huge amounts of money out of the game for the house
That's
is
a
obviously
tax.
much harder to beat. Yeah, it's a huge tax. It's just kind of unbeatable for some of the games. So that's another thing you have to factor in. You have to factor in like how good are my opponents? How good do they seem? How much money is coming out of it from the house, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, now I'm gonna go back to, what I know everybody on the channel or watching or listening is really probably super interested in, and that's your study of tells and body language and things like that. First off, the cash games you played, would you say that tells and body language may be more important in the loose games with the less skilled players versus in tournament play?
Well, I think there's probably I'd say overall there's less skilled players in tournaments because it attracts people who might only play a few times a year.
Oh, okay.
I'd say it's different. The dynamics are different. In tournaments, there's more of a buildup and more tension around like, well, if I get knocked out, I'm out for good. There's
Hmm.
more of an excitement there, and there can be more tension related tells. Somebody more likely to look tense, behave tense when they're making a big bluff for all their stack in a tournament, versus in a cash game when you can just rebuy. Rebuys are common. People are always adding on money, and it's a much looser environment. So there's
Hmm.
the in cash games it's much more, you get much more loose tells of people betraying their relaxation. For example, it's because it's not a tournament and they're not worried so much about getting knocked out. They're kind of just like talking, while they're playing, or they're more loose physically, things like that. And I think that actually, so I was mainly playing almost entirely cash games, which I think informed the way I wrote my stuff. The things I decided to focus on, because I
Hmm.
sometimes poker players ask me like, is this applicable to tournaments? And I'll tell them like, well, I think these things are probably more applicable than these things over here. You're more likely to hear people talking and get verbal tells in a cash game because people are more loose and people are more silent in tournaments. So they're definitely different environments, but I think by and large the behavior you see Matt is very similar. It's the same behavior. It's just a matter of like how present it is, basically.
Okay, and I'm wondering, and I talked to you a little bit before we started too, but in the poker environment, is it a very controlled atmosphere, with set amount of parameters? And by that I mean like if you're going to do an interrogation in the police department, it's a controlled setting in the meeting room, where everybody is, things like that. Is it similar with poker because there's rules and basic atmosphere?
Yeah, it's a very it's a very formalized setting. I mean, the nice thing about poker for studying behavior is that there are definite situational, contextual things that happen over and over again, right? Like the same spots keep coming up. You have to look at the cards on when the flop comes out, the communal cards come out. You have to check or bet. You have to reach for your chips. You have to bet on the river, make a big bet on the river. That's a common thing to do because the pot's big. And there's these very formalized things that happen over and over, which allows you to study people in the same situation over and over, even more so than even in an interrogation. It's as structured as it may be, there's still like a wide open landscape of how somebody can act, and there's not clear things someone has to do, like physical motions or things like that. So that's the nice thing about it. And it allows you to do things like, for example, when I'm studying poker footage from the World Series of Poker or in another show, it allows you to do things like, I'm going to look at this one player and see how he looks in this one situation with different cards,
Over and
over and
over and
over.
over. Ah,
Yes, and that's when what I did for my books. For example, even for the verbal book, the verbal poker tells, I actually made a spreadsheet, and I worked on this book for like 8 months full time. That was all I did, and I recorded statements that people made in different situations from televised poker tournaments, and also when I went to play, I would write things down. And then that allowed me to like organize it by situation. Like someone's saying this kind of statement. Now let's examine the situations they were in when they made that kind of statement. Like, did they have a strong hand? Was it post flop? Was it pre flop? Was it late in the hand? Was it early in the hand? Was it when they were waiting to act, like the action wasn't on them, or was it after they had bet? So there's all these situational factors that allow you to examine people in these different situations. But yeah, to answer your question, it's very formalized, and I think that's the nice thing about it, that it allows that, which I think I'm surprised we don't see more scientific studies around it, because I mean we do. There are some, obviously, studying behavioral aspects in poker scenarios, but I'm surprised there's not more, because I can just think of so many interesting studies you can make about like heart rate and like galvanic, skin response, conductivity. There's just so many elements of you could study about someone in different scenarios, like whether they have a strong hand at the end of the hand and they're checking, laying a trap or something. What are the elements that keep coming up?
Get fMRI on them and
yeah, exactly. Yeah, fMRI, that'd be fantastic if you could set that up. Just so many possibilities. And yeah, sometimes I wish I was, if I was like a millionaire, I'd be like, hey, go do this study I thought of.
Well, do you run your theories against while you're televising? I mean, like, okay, we all play Jeopardy to see if we got the answer right, or Wheel of Fortune. When you're studying the tournaments, do you say, okay, he's going to win this hand, or this is going to be the cards coming up, and see if you're, on
Yeah.
or psychic?
Well,
So,
yeah, that's a good question, because one of the things I recommend to people who, if they're like, well, how do I learn more about tells? I recommend they find footage from televised games where the whole cards were not shown, right? So you can find, even the World Series of Poker main event did that for a couple years, where the final table, they didn't show the whole cards. It was on a delay where it was like 30 seconds would pass after the end of the hand or something, and then they show it, or after everybody folded or something. But and that's actually the best way, because otherwise, yeah, you have that cognitive, bias, that confirmation bias of like, oh yeah, I kind of knew it was that or something. But the best example of that, when I was watching one of the World Series of Poker main events, final tables, it was with the hole cards off, and one of the players, actually it was heads up. It was two players that had come down to the final two players. And this was like in 2011, I think. And I was watching that and forming my opinions, and all of a sudden I spotted something where I was like, oh, this guy had been looking at his opponent almost always, like that was his status quo thing. His MO was to stare at his opponent, and all of a sudden he looks at his cards and is just looking down. and I was like, oh, he's probably got aces or something good, aces, kings, queens, because you know first of all, those strong hands are quite rare, so it makes sense that he would be doing his normal MO, and then something caused him to change that's more rare. So that was the first thing. And then the flop came out and he continues looking down, and I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty sure he's strong here. And sure enough, he had aces. And then once I saw that, I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to start looking for that behavior. And it was
Mm.
like, it was super correlated. It was, and I did a YouTube video about it later. And just showing like how much he would start looking down, and kind of an instinctual way of like, well, I don't want to intimidate my opponent. My usual MO might be to stare them down,
Right.
but when I get a strong hand for his blind spot was,
He was
uh,
sandbagging, right? Because he
yeah, it was
wanted to
kind of
kind
like
of
he wanted to
sucker
be
him in.
shy. Yeah, he wanted to put on a, like, and I don't think it was something he wasn't like he was intentionally doing that. And that's the interesting thing about PokerTells. It's like it's not like people are acting, because I think in his mind he's like, I'm trying to portray a tough, my normal thing is to stare at somebody and portray a tough thing, but his blind spot was not realizing like, oh, I'm looking down a little bit more, and I he had this pattern that I don't think he was aware of, because he was very new to live poker. He was an online player and just wasn't, that experienced in live
Ah,
poker.
okay,
So
okay.
that was interesting. But yeah, it's great to watch that when I can, or when anyone can. It's great to get that experience of like testing your theories and being like, well, how much do I really know about what's going on here? Even for strategy stuff too, because you can be like, try to guess, what would they be doing this with, if I don't see their cards.
When you consult for players, is that what you're doing in that case? Is you're watching them to tell them their tells, or you're watching the other players to tell them the other players' tells?
It's been both. It's so when I consulted for the two World Series of Poker main event final table lists who I consulted for, and this was in 2013, 2015. Those were the biggest consulting things I did. It was to, they had already made the final table. So back then, if you made the final table, they played it. They played the initial tournament in like July, and then it would play down to like the final 9 players, and then they would take a few months break and play the final table in November. So they call it the November 9. So there was a big break, and so that allowed the players to prepare for that. So yeah, they would hire me to look at the existing footage of other players and themselves, which was from the tournament they had just played, which was already televised, or some of the players might have been in other tournaments too, because it's kind of a small universe of strong players. So for a lot of the players, you could find like other tournaments that had been
Mm.
online elsewhere, even if it was like a casino put up final, some footage from a tournament that was like obscure that you had to go hunt down. So watching all that, and then during the final table itself, I was looking for interesting things and sending it to the people that worked with him more closely. I was watching him from a distance, but he had people like on the rail,
Oh,
as they call it, beside the table that he would talk to occasionally. So kind of like a boxing match, kind of like trainer in the corner kind of thing.
right.
But to be honest, when you get to that level of like these people taking it that seriously, and they had several
Yeah.
months to prepare also, like these people are like trying to be as buttoned down as possible, and it's pretty unlikely. I found valuable tells like the one I was telling you about. That was a very valuable tell. Like they exist and they're findable, and there's strong correlations you can find, but it's also much more rare to find it in that setting than it would be in like your everyday game that's much more relaxed, for example.
Right. Well, you're like it's kind of like the Olympics. Like I'm out of shape running wise, but when you get to that nosebleed territory of talent, that tell, that marginal gain, that 1% is actually a giant win
Right.
for them because their, their margin of error is so tiny that if you can flip that 1%, even a half a percent
Right,
is actually blowing out.
they're playing for millions. Yeah, I mean, like the people I consulted for, one guy won 3 million, the other guy won like 5 million, I think. They're playing for millions of dollars. So, and like you said, yeah, the if you're playing against very strong players, that little bit of information, even if it's like just a slightly valuable clue, or like more likely to be true than not, if it changes your mind in a close spot, like in a spot where you could have either called or folded, like you weren't sure which one was right from a strategic perspective. But if you knew, like, well, this guy looks down a little bit more when he's strong, then that's going to lead me to call or to fold or whatever. That little clue can, like you said, yeah, we're talking like very big numbers and very small margins of of error, or very small edges, basically. Yeah, theoretically.
Well, this is perfect. Now, to wrap things up, where can people learn more from you on how to tell?
I would say, I mean, I have a lot of videos on YouTube that are free. So if you look for Reading Poker Tells, which is kind of my first book title that I used, Reading
Mhm.
Poker Tells YouTube channel, that's a good place to start. Then you can kind of get a sense like, oh, I like this stuff. And I would say also, even if you don't like poker, I think my second book, Verbal Poker Tells, I've had people tell me that it helped them in like in law and in medicine, like helping understand their patients better. And
Mhm.
I think it's like you and I were talking about. I was inspired by Mark McClish's book,
Yes.
his book about statement analysis, to write Verbal Poker Tells. And a lot of the, some of the same concepts apply. I mean, poker is a very formalized, a unique atmosphere, but that was the inspiration for me to study those statements with the same kind of rigor that, and examination that Mark was doing in his book. And I think a lot of that stuff, if people are new to those ideas, like I would
Mhm.
sooner recommend Mark's book for general purposes. But if you want to learn about some of those kind of concepts and are interested in poker, that would be a cool place to start. Because I think it's basically making, the gist of that book, my book, was thinking more thinking more in depth about the things people say and looking for the logic of how statements show up and how they're likely to show up. Yeah.
Okay, so and your website is readingpokertells.com, and I'm sure that will link to everything, right? All
Right,
your
that's
your
got
your
that's got everything. I got a
books. Yeah.
podcast too. I've got my psychology and behavior podcast where I just, I'm interested in other things besides. I'm just interested in psychology stuff in general. So I interview various experts in various fields, and that's what that podcast is.
Very cool. And I actually, when I was preparing for Mark McClish, who's been on my show, I listened to your episode with him a while back.
He's an very interesting guy. Yeah, I like that stuff. And people often ask me like, "Oh, what's your thoughts on this behavior that such and such did in the news or current events?" And I'm like, I don't usually have strong opinions about the behavior, the physical behavior, because that can vary so much in real life. But the statement analysis stuff, is where I see most of the value in examining real world things. Yeah, I'll leave you with that.
Awesome. Well, hey,
Thanks a lot.
thank you. Thanks so much for coming on, man.